Okay, so it's with enormous amounts of pleasure that I invite on the podium our first external speaker, who is Frank van Harmelen. Roughly speaking, we thought it would be quite cool to have one person more on the knowledge side and one person more on the media side. But of course, as you learned from various talks today, actually the two sides are so intertwined nowadays that it's difficult to separate them. But the thing about Frank is he's been a great friend of ours and collaborator for many, many years. He's one of the leading scientists in the world. Actually, he's one of the leading computer scientists in the world. And specifically, he works very much in areas which intersect very much with KMI, such as semantic technologies. He's the head of the knowledge representation and reasoning group at the Free University of Amsterdam. And also he's the director of the Network Institute, which is actually something that I only knew a little bit about before actually reading what Frank is up to. It's an interdisciplinary institute which brings together researchers in computer science, social sciences, humanities, economics, law, and philosophy. And it's really great because this really dovetails very much with what Peter was saying earlier, which is, knowledge media is all about data, transforming data into knowledge through various medias, and also by bringing, various type of people to make the analysis together. And I think this is really an exciting thing. So without any further delay, over to Frank. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So it's a real privilege to get this invitation. We've been working together, so I've been working together with different people from KMI over the years. Over lunch, we were trying to figure out how long we went back. I think our first meeting we figured out was in 1986, which means I know you about as long as I know my wife, right? So, we've been working over the years together, also with John, with Mathieu, with Danek, with many different people in KMI. So my role as a colleague from the field is to sketch a little bit the history of the content of the work, or at least part of the work that's been going on at KMI. So looking back, moving forward, and I will talk about three historical periods, and I will discuss briefly each of them. And the remarkable thing, and I'll say up front, is that this is a period of history in branches of computer science that stretch back to, say, the early 90s. And really, people in KMI have played an important role in all of these three historical periods, right? So that's a period that stretches well over the 20 years that we're celebrating now. It goes back even further than that. But before I talk about these three historical periods starting from the 90s, I should go back even one step further. So I want to go back to what's like computing prehistory, right? So really dig up some of the historical artifacts from our field, and some of us are old enough to remember these buzzwords, right? So in the 70s, it was Feigenbaum with his slogan, "The power is in the knowledge," right? So until that time, and what he meant was that we should really equip computers with the knowledge about the stuff that they are manipulating, right? So information is not just bits in a computer, right? We should know what the bits stand for, right? He used words like expert systems, which was a new word then. Now he talked about knowledge engineering, right? So that wasn't electrical engineering or chemical engineering, but knowledge engineering, right? So expertise as a core topic in modeling expertise, as a core topic in computer science. So for those of you who don't recognize these words, that's what we call it today, right? So this is really about semantics, right? About the fact that it's important to know what these bits mean, what they stand for. And that is not a trivial idea, right? It may sound completely obvious to this audience, but in many fields of computer science, they're actually proud that they don't know what the bits stand for. So I have a very distinguished colleague in computer networks, right? And he says, I manipulate bits, and I don't want to know what the bits stand for, right? I just ship them very, very well from A to B, right? Databases, they manipulate bits. They really don't want to know what their schemas mean. They just manipulate the bits. Machine learning, they are learning patterns without really knowing what the patterns stand for, and even in logic, right? Logic doesn't really want to commit to what the symbols stand for, whether it's alpha or beta or x and epsilon and z. You can just replace the symbols. It's only the structure that matters. Right? Whereas I think the big commitment in the many years of work that we've done together is that it's important to know what the bytes stand for, and that gives you extra leverage and extra power. So I want to go through a little bit of these historical periods and show how that really gave us ways of making progress. So patterns of reasoning, and we used to call them problem-solving methods. So I think one of the other things that bind us together is Bob Wielinga is one of the, I think, the role models in my career, just as Mark has been one of the role models in many of your careers, and Bob and Mark were actually collaborating very closely, I think up to the mid-90s maybe. So problem-solving methods. So what's the idea here, right? So the idea is that reasoning is not just, if humans reason and you want to model human reasoning in a computer, you don't just do some arbitrary form of computation. There is repeating patterns in that reasoning. And you can actually you can do science about the patterns of reasoning that reoccur over and over and over again. And over a period that started even earlier than the 90s, so in the mid-80s up to say the mid-90s, many people in Amsterdam, in Edinburgh, in Nottingham, it was very much here at KMI, it was very much a European effort to find these patterns of reasoning. So when you do diagnosis, in a way it doesn't really matter if you're diagnosing a photocopier or a car or a patient. There is something prototypical about the task of diagnostic reasoning. And can we write down in a precise but abstract way what it is that makes diagnostic reasoning into diagnostic reasoning rather than just arbitrary some bit of computation, some algorithm. Monitoring, say, design, when you're designing something, right? There's different ways of designing something, so we could maybe distinguish different types of design. We could build a whole library of these problem-solving methods per reasoning task. So there's actually books published with libraries of these reasoning tasks. It's the science of these patterns of reasoning. So think of a diagnosis, right? So if you have a simple machine of which only 7 things can go wrong, what is the best way of diagnosing that machine? Well, you just enumerate all 7 things, right? Is it the first problem? No, it's not. Is it the second problem? No, it's not, until you hit the problem that is. It's only 7, it's a list 7 long. Right? You would be very surprised if your GP would do that to you, right? You go to your GP and say, well, is it this? No, it's not that. Oh, is it this? No, let's go down the list, right? So the average GP treats about 2,000 different disease patterns in a week, right? So that doesn't make any sense. So there we need to do something completely different. You would need to do something which we call cover and differentiate. So what your GP does is he asks for your symptoms, or she asks for your symptoms. She creates a hypothesis of what it could be. Actually, she creates multiple hypotheses because your symptoms typically don't point to a single disease. And she then tries to differentiate between these different hypotheses by asking you questions for more symptoms. Well, if you don't have a fever, it can't be an infection, for example. Right? So that's a completely different problem-solving method for the same reasoning task. And the same for design. You can design by hierarchical refinement. So you say, my system needs to consist of 5 components, and then each of those 5 components, they need to consist of subcomponents, and I'm designing this by hierarchical refinement. Now, it turns out that if you design many things, and the prototypical example in our literature was elevators, if you design elevators, you're doing this hierarchical refinement all the time, and it's the same every time. Because every elevator consists of a motor block, a braking system, a transport cabin, a lift shaft, and so on, right? So there's no point in doing this hierarchical refinement all the time. You may as well propose a fixed skeleton design and then refine that skeletal design for the particular elevator that you want to have at the time. Right? Is it a 20-story high person elevator or only a 5-story high cargo elevator? So again, different problem-solving methods for the same reasoning task, and a very detailed and precise typology and science emerged of those different reasoning tasks. that research, you could even consider that a nice piece of finished research. That really ended in a stable body of knowledge that was written up, that was implemented, that was taught to students, that was being used by industry. Right? So attention of that same community that we were all part of shifted, say, around the mid-90s, after the mid-90s, to not the patterns of reasoning, but the patterns of representation. Of course, those reasoning tasks that I just described, they actually use knowledge that is somehow represented. Right? So this led to this entire study of ontologies. And by the way, at my university, I would really do anything to have a vice chancellor that can say the word ontology and know what he means. Right? I was very impressed. You are lucky guys. So what is an ontology? Reusable hierarchies of objects, of types of objects, of relationships between objects. Right? So it's not about the reasoning, it's about the representation. And they come in all shapes and flavors, and in the beginning there were sort of religious wars about what you could call an ontology and what you couldn't call an ontology. Right? But I think in the end we've become very all-embracing, and ontologies now come in different types and shapes and sizes. There's big medical ontologies, 300,000 terms to describe the medical domain. There's also some very small ontologies. Anybody knows the meta-ontology? You're using it every time you fly. Right? So it's the vocabulary that pilots use to communicate to the ground staff about the air conditions, the weather conditions at airports. Right? And of course, if people can use that vocabulary to communicate about the weather conditions, then machines can use it to communicate about weather conditions. So the meta-ontology is used to communicate between the autopilot and the ground weather stations about the weather conditions at airports. And I'm convinced that this is a British invention because the meta-ontology has 5 different words for fog. Right? And apparently these distinctions matter for pilots. Right? Some of them are very mundane and highly useful, so the schema.org, which is run by all the big search engines. Some of them are very sophisticated and philosophical, like Psych and others. But both this study of reusable reasoning patterns and reusable representation patterns, they were all conducted in fairly, should I say, closed and well-controlled environments. We were building systems, and we were the masters of our own knowledge base, right? And if it didn't work, we would hammer the knowledge base until it worked, because we were in control, right? So that allowed us also to make all kinds of simplifying assumptions. We could assume that the different bits of knowledge that we used, that they would interoperate. And if they didn't, we hammered it until they interoperated, right? And we could assume that they didn't change while we were using them, right? Because we were the boss of our own knowledge base. So something very interesting happened in this third phase of this historical story, say after the turn of the century, now really when the web met knowledge representation, right? So once you take knowledge representation out of a system on your desk in a box and out to the web, you can no longer make all of those simplifying assumptions, right? You are using bits of knowledge that you didn't make yourself, so they don't interoperate. Those bits of knowledge, they are changing while you are using them. They are so big that so big as you've never seen them before in a single box. So size, dynamics, heterogeneity, all of them were new challenges that were facing that community after knowledge representation met the web. And a very interesting thing happened too. A famous phrase from the 90s was the knowledge acquisition bottleneck. Right? So it was, how do we get the knowledge, or how do we model the knowledge that is hidden, often in implicit forms, in experts' behavior, in experts' heads, in the textbooks? How do we model that knowledge? That was considered a bottleneck. Right? Once you go out on the web and everybody can contribute to these knowledge sources, we had almost the opposite problem. Right? So instead of wondering about how do we get the knowledge, the question became, well, what the heck do we do with all this knowledge? Right? It became a problem of plenties instead of a problem of scarcity. So after, say, 10, 15 years of doing that work, and KMI has really played a crucial role in that, we can now honestly build knowledge bases that have billions, really tens of billions of relationships between hundreds of millions of objects from hundreds of thousands of different sources, right? And these knowledge bases, they cover politics, science, everyday life, sport, culture, you name it, right? And those knowledge bases are available online, on the web, and being used by real organizations that aren't interested in knowledge representation except when it helps them to do their job. It was very interesting to hear the Vice Chancellor speak about his experiences with the BBC. Every time you use Google, you get this nice front page on the right-hand side. You don't get a list of documents on the right-hand side. You get structured information about the object that you're asking. Now, that is a direct spin-off of the work in the semantic web community in which KMI played a big part. Okay, so last few minutes, what's next? Right, so the title of this talk was A Dance of Theory and Practice. And it's a quote from a wonderful paper that Tom Gruber wrote in a special issue that Enrico edited at the 25th anniversary of the journal, right? That he's editor of. And it is a really a wonderful piece by Tom Gruber where he describes how this fairly small community, if you compare it to, say, machine learning community or database community, this knowledge engineering community and later semantic web community is actually fairly small, and how it had a sort of an oversized impact compared to its how many people are involved. And that big impact is largely due to this fact that it's constantly a dance between theory and practice, right? It's constantly switching between building things, learning from building things, coming up with new theory, asking new questions, trying them out by building things. I think in that dance of theory and practice, the current state is that we are much better at practice than we are at theory, right? So we can now build the largest knowledge base ever, right? With billions and billions of knowledge statements about hundreds of millions of objects, but we barely understand, we barely know the structure of this knowledge base. And even if we would know the structure, which we barely do, we certainly don't know why it has this structure and not some other structure. And we certainly don't know how to best exploit that structure. So in a way, over the last 10 years, we've been so successful using previous theory and new technology that the previous theory is now falling short, right? If you look at the formal foundations of semantic web, it is 20th century foundations, right? And I'm going to show you two small examples of how little we know and where I think really interesting new challenges are, and that's just a few examples, just two. So the structure of the knowledge web, right? So the first thing is, well, what do you mean when you say knowledge web? Right, so at the picture on the far left, you see this is what knowledge graphs look in detail. So the oval things are objects, the arrows are relationships between objects, or they are types of objects and relationships between types of objects, right? So this is the knowledge graph in its finest detail, right? And that graph has so we are harvesting, in Amsterdam, we are harvesting the worldwide graph. The latest count was somewhere just short of 40 billion edges. Okay, so that graph of 40 billion edges that we have locally has this very fine-grained structure. But the picture that we typically paint in our slides is the picture in the middle, where every bubble is a big aggregation of sometimes hundreds of thousands or even millions of those small nodes. So that's the kind of macro view of that micro network. So there's a big aggregation between the left and the middle diagrams. But even that middle diagram, you could look at it a different way. So you could look at the knowledge structure, so which bits of the knowledge base are pointing to which other bits of the knowledge base. But that big knowledge, distributed knowledge network lives on a network of physically distributed servers, right? And we certainly don't understand how the physical distribution of the network correlates to the logical distribution of the network. So this picture is actually very misleading. This picture, it gives you this nice feeling that's a sort of homogeneously distributed knowledge base, right? This picture is actually closer to the truth, right? So here you see that it's not very homogeneously distributed. There's clusters there, right? And there's some nodes which are unreasonably central. Right? And if you add a little bit more analysis, the actual picture looks like this. Right? So what does this picture tell us? Well, we barely know that this is the picture. Right? It's very hard to draw these pictures at a scale of 40 billion graphs, 40 billion edges. So we can see it's a single component. We can see that there are clusters. We can see that the connectivity depends on very few nodes. It's a very brittle network. It would be very easy to break it. Right? we could see that some nodes are very densely connected and other ones are not, but we don't know what any of these observations mean, right? So, for example, does the meaning of a node depend on the context, on the cluster that it appears in? Well, the current the theoretical foundations tell you it's not the case. The meaning of a node is not influenced by its neighbors. Now, that sounds entirely unreasonable, right, if you think of this as a network. But if you look at the formal theory of the semantic foundations, now, your neighbors don't influence what you mean, but clearly it should, right? So does path length correlate with semantic distance, right? Are things that are further apart in the graph, do they actually somehow, are they less semantically related? What does it mean if you have a lot of neighbors? Does it mean that a lot of people trust you, or that you have a very important concept, or that you contain more information? We don't even know what the meaning of the degree distribution is. So these are really foundational questions that now popping up because we have been so technologically successful. Second and last example, it turns out that the usage of this knowledge base is very uneven. So I said there is 40 billion edges, and you can query. Now you can ask this graph questions, and it'll give you answers about all these different topics that I mentioned. But the distribution of the use of this graph is very uneven. So here's a small experiment we did. Right? Just look at the top line. So we run 1,600 queries that we harvested from real users. We didn't make them up. They are real users who query one of the big nodes in that graph. Right? Those 1,600 queries, they use 0.003% of the graph, which is tiny, right? So to give you some idea, to scale that up, in order to hit 1% of the graph with your queries, you would need 500,000 queries. So somehow a very small percentage of the graph is responsible for answering all of those queries, right? So there's kind of hotspots. The hotspots in the graph do all the work, and then there's a lot of stuff around it that is rarely, if ever, visited. Right? And that doesn't appear, it's not a property of that single top line, but that phenomenon can be repeated in experiments across different knowledge bases. Right? So then we thought, well, it would be great to know where the hotspots are, and we can measure it, but it would be even better if we can predict where the hotspots are. If I could show you a graph, and just by looking at the structure of the graph, you could tell me where the hotspots are. And one of my PhD students came up with this idea, and I thought, this cannot be done. You could only do this if you know the queries. And once you know the queries, you can find the hotspots. Right? And it's one of these great moments when, as a supervisor, you are really completely wrong. Right? So that's the best moments. So what you see here on the horizontal line is we're growing our sub-selection of the graph. Right? So first we're sampling 10% of the graph and then 20% of the graph. And we're sampling in a structure-driven way, in a way that is informed by the structure of the graph only. We don't know the queries here. Right? But we're sampling the graph. Now you see that on the steepest curve, after sampling 10% of the graph, we can reliably answer 95% of the queries. Right? That is unreasonably good. And that is without knowing the queries in advance. Right? And this works across all these different graphs. For some it works better, for some it works a bit less, but for all of them it works unreasonably well. Right? So this is an observation that we cannot currently understand. So this is another example where our technology has run ahead of our theory, and our theory is just not able to explain these kind of phenomena. Right, so I think there is we can be proud of the achievements, going all the way back to the early 90s, mid-90s, the last 10, 15 years. I think our community, of which KMI is an important part, has made a real impact. And I didn't put all those companies' logos there. Yeah. For nothing, I put them there for a good reason, but there are real interesting open challenges, really deep scientific questions to be answered there. So I would define your mission, our mission for the future is don't let others forget that it matters what the bytes stand for, right? Yeah. The machine learners still didn't get it, right? The machine learners still think they can just learn patterns, right? Without understanding what the pattern actually refers to. Right? So by the way, it's semantics. So I want to read out this quote from Tom Gruber from the same paper that I mentioned before. So ultimately we would ask, can machines bootstrap off the substrate of human knowledge to greater intelligence? Well, it wouldn't happen by sheer quantity of data or speed of computation as some have predicted. It will require meaningful structures to bias induction and steer the universal learning machine towards useful generalizations. Right? He doesn't use the S word here, but he says, keep steering the semantic course. So I want to finish with a congratulation. I think that really ties in with your newbie theme, Mark. Happy birthday to someone who somehow manages to keep getting older while remaining breathtakingly young. Right.
Thank you very much, Frank. That was really a breathtaking talk. Time for questions. Where are the microphones? One is there. Yep. Good. Questions? Paul? I think Paul first here, and then Martin. Paul goes first, and you go second. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Can I just check? I understand really what you're saying there, Frank, about those challenges, those questions. They seem to me almost to be experimental or sociological questions about the usage, about how people use the web, rather than theoretical, logical questions of computer science. Is that fair, or?
I think you're partly right, but you're overstating it. So I think they are combined questions of both the sociology of these systems and their technical features. So you can ask, now in this picture that I drew with this unreasonably central node, right? We all know it's DBpedia, right? So why is DBpedia in the center there, right? So there's a technical answer, because it has so many rich concepts and it provides a fantastic semantic target to link to. That's a computer science answer, right? The economic answer would be, well, they're first to market, right? They just happen to be the first one, and then you get preferential attachment and the biggest node gets bigger, right? And I think the real theory should be a combination of those two, but not mostly sociological, but certainly not only computational.
Yeah, okay, right. Thanks,
yeah.
Thanks.
Martin?
I feel guilty for hogging questions. I think it's the third one I've asked, but I'll shut up after this. I come from a cybernetics background, and I'm one of your hated machine learners. I want to ask you, more generally, stretching your thoughts to the semantic web. I've always been a semantic web skeptic because I find it difficult to conceive how we would encode that knowledge or represent that knowledge in a way that was not just bits and bytes, but that was meaningfully there. What would you say to a skeptic like me to make me believe the semantic web is real?
Okay, well, so the semantic web in a technical sense is real, right? So ask Google, ask the BBC, ask Elsevier, ask the Library of Congress, ask Yahoo. So in the technical sense, the semantic web is real, but I think you're asking a more philosophical question. So you're asking, well, how could we ever really encode knowledge in a machine, right? Without it being bits. So my answer would be, so clearly ultimately they will be bits, right? But while you are doing the encoding, it really helps to know what the bits stood for. Right? So when you are, so think of these reasoning patterns that we did in the 90s, right? That it really helps in the analysis and in the quality of the resulting library of algorithms that you remember what those things stand for. And then we can have an even deeper philosophical debate about whether then the computer knows what they stand for or not, right? Let's not go there now, but I think that as a computing methodology, it really helps to keep that in mind. And so that is completely contrary to what, say, my network colleague says, that he transports bits from A to B, and he's proud of not knowing what the bits stand for. My claim would be that he could design better network protocols if he would realize what the bits stood for. Would you buy that? He's not saying yes.
He's not saying no either. One last question from Fridolin.
About practicality with a question about theory. A lot of whispers tell me that distributional semantics may be the next theoretical foundation for the semantic web. What's your take on that, and what directions would it go?
So I won't, but I should really ask you now what you mean by distributional semantics. But I think I will take your answer, your question to mean do I think the future foundation should be different from just classical logic? And the answer is certainly yes. Right? So classical logic it was a great crutches to start working on, but they are no longer do because we're now running and the crutches are getting in the way. And I think statistical, distributional, more say techniques from complex systems even would be more relevant than only the classical logic. Yeah, you agree with that? Okay. I got one.
Okay. I suggest you stop here. Thank you very much, Frank.
Yeah,
That was
thank you.
brilliant.